What would you do if you found out the person responsible for your father's death was sitting in front of you, wearing a judge's robe? What would you do if you found out the person responsible for your father's death was sitting in front of you, wearing a judge's robe? The packed courtroom fell into stunned silence as 14-year-old Jalen Carter stood up, his hands trembling with rage. His small frame shook with anger, his heart pounding in his chest as he pointed an accusing finger at Judge William Harrington. The noise in the room died away completely, and for a moment it seemed like time had stopped. "You killed my father," Jalen shouted, his voice filled with emotion, his words echoing through the courtroom. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Lawyers turned their heads in disbelief. The jury exchanged shocked glances, and even the stenographer stopped typing, trying to process the outburst. The judge, known for his cold, ruthless demeanor, froze for the first time in his career. His eyes widened, a flash of panic crossing his face before he regained his composure. "I beg your pardon?" Judge Harrington sneered, his voice dripping with disdain. He leaned back in his chair, fixing his gaze on Jalen with a look that could freeze the blood of anyone in the room. "Watch your tone, boy." The command was sharp, meant to silence the teenager who dared to accuse him of something so grave. But Jalen wasn't backing down, not this time. This was the moment he had been waiting for his entire life. Jalen's fists clenched, his knuckles white from the tension. His emotions were running high, but he wasn't afraid. He had rehearsed this in his mind 1,000 times, had dreamed of standing in front of this man, the one who had taken everything from him. His father had died under mysterious circumstances years ago, a tragic accident that had been dismissed as a simple case of bad luck. But Jalen had known the truth all along, the truth that no one had been willing to see. Judge Harrington had been involved in a hit-and-run that killed his father. The evidence had been buried, and the case had been closed without even a proper investigation. Jalen had spent years working in silence, gathering the pieces of a puzzle that no one else had bothered to solve. He had waited for this moment, the moment when he could confront the man who had destroyed his family, who had manipulated the system to protect himself. And now that moment had arrived. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Every eye was on Jalen, but he didn't flinch. He wasn't just confronting a judge. He was confronting the power structure that had denied him justice for so long. The courtroom, once filled with the usual sounds of shuffling papers and murmured conversations, was now a place of tension and anticipation. Judge Harrington's face twisted in irritation as he tried to regain control of the room. "This is outrageous," he muttered under his breath, clearly rattled but unwilling to show weakness. He slammed his gavel down with a force that rattled the walls. "Order in the court!" But Jalen didn't move. His voice was steady, unwavering. "I've waited years for this," he said, his words slow but deliberate. "You took my father's life, and you thought you could get away with it. Well, not anymore." The judge's eyes flickered with something between annoyance and fear, but he didn't respond. For the first time in his career, Judge Harrington seemed to be out of words, out of control. The courtroom, once his domain, had become a place where his power was no longer absolute. Jalen stood tall, refusing to let anyone intimidate him. This was his truth, and no one could take it away from him. This was his moment. He had the courage to do what no one else had dared to do, to stand up to the system, to the very person who had caused his pain. And as the room buzzed with whispers and murmurs, Jalen knew one thing. He wasn't backing down. If you were in Jalen's position, would you have confronted the judge? Tell us in the comments. Jalen's life had been forever changed 5 years ago. His father, Marcus Carter, had been a hard-working man, a loving father, a dedicated community leader, and a man who always stood up for justice. Marcus had spent his life helping others, guiding young people, and speaking out against injustice wherever he saw it. He was someone who believed in doing what was right, no matter the cost. To his son, Marcus had been a hero, the kind of man who could never be replaced. But that all changed one night. It started like any other night. Marcus had been driving home from work, eager to see his family. But then, as he made his way through a quiet neighborhood, he was pulled over by 2 officers for what they called a routine stop. It seemed harmless enough at the time. There had been no indication that anything was wrong. But Marcus never made it home. The details of that night were still unclear, but one thing was certain: Marcus was no threat. He had complied with the officers, had followed every instruction they gave him. But in the blink of an eye, everything went wrong. The situation escalated quickly. His family was told later that he had been shot during the stop, and by the time anyone could react, Marcus was dead. The aftermath was even worse. The officers who had killed Marcus walked free. No charges, no trial. It was as if Marcus's life had meant nothing. Judge William Harrington, the same judge who was now sitting on the bench across from Jalen, had overseen the case. He had thrown it out without a second thought, dismissing any potential wrongdoing on the officer's part. Marcus was labeled a threat in police reports that were never questioned, and his family was left in the dark, grieving without closure. At the time, Jalen was just 9 years old. He remembered every detail with painful clarity. He remembered the way his mother had cried, how her eyes were red and swollen, and how her hands trembled as she tried to comfort him. He remembered the cold dismissal in the courtroom when the officers were allowed to walk free, the anger that churned in his stomach as he looked around and saw no one willing to stand up for his father. He remembered the face of the man who had made it all happen, Judge William Harrington, sitting at the front of the room, making decisions that would change their lives forever. It was a feeling of helplessness that Jalen could never forget. But what hurt most was the fact that the man who had allowed his father's death to go unpunished was still in power. Judge Harrington's career had continued unscathed, while Marcus Carter's death had been swept under the rug, his life reduced to a statistic. Now, 5 years later, Jalen found himself back in that same courtroom, standing before the same judge. This time, however, he wasn't just watching. This time, he had evidence. It was all Jalen had been waiting for, the moment when he could finally make the truth known, when he could expose the injustice that had torn his family apart. He had spent the last 5 years preparing for this, combing through documents, talking to witnesses, and gathering proof that the officers had been involved in more than just a routine stop. Jalen had uncovered the hidden details, the pieces of evidence that had been deliberately ignored. And now it was his turn to take control of the narrative. He wasn't a child anymore, unable to understand what had happened. He was 14, and he understood exactly what had been done to his family. He understood how power and privilege had shielded the people responsible for his father's death. But more than that, he knew that this time things would be different. This time, he would make sure the truth was heard. As Jalen stood there in the courtroom ready to speak, he realized this was the moment he had been preparing for his entire life. He wasn't going to shrink back. He wasn't going to let the judge and everyone else in that room treat his father's death like it was just another case to be dismissed. This time, he was going to fight for justice. What would you have done if you were in Jalen's shoes? Tell us in the comments. Judge Harrington's smug expression didn't last long. His eyes narrowed as Jalen stood in the center of the courtroom, unwavering, his small frame projecting a confidence that was impossible to ignore. The silence in the room was deafening, everyone waiting for the judge to react, to regain control of the situation. "What nonsense are you talking about, boy?" the judge snapped, his voice dripping with disdain. He glared at Jalen, his face flushed with anger, his knuckles white as they gripped the edge of his bench. He clearly didn't expect a challenge from the young boy, much less an accusation this bold. Jalen didn't flinch. He remained calm, his eyes locked on the judge's, his heart steady. He reached into his pocket slowly, deliberately, and pulled out a small USB drive, the secret weapon he had carried with him for months. His fingers tightened around it before he held it up for everyone to see. "I have proof," Jalen said, his voice steady but carrying an undeniable weight. "I know what you did." The room went dead silent. A collective breath was held as every person in the courtroom, from the jury to the spectators, shifted in their seats. No one had expected this. Judge Harrington's eyes darted to the USB drive, and for the first time his confidence wavered. "Your Honor, I'd like to submit new evidence," Jalen's attorney said, stepping forward. His voice was clear and firm, the authority in his tone unmistakable. He had been waiting for this moment, just as much as Jalen had. Judge Harrington's face turned pale. The smug expression he wore earlier had disappeared, replaced by an unmistakable look of unease. For the first time, the judge looked nervous. His eyes flickered between Jalen and the lawyer, his arrogance slipping away. "What is this?" he barked, his voice laced with frustration and fear. Jalen took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment settle in his chest. He knew this was it, the moment that would expose the truth. He didn't hesitate. "The night my father was killed, the police report said their body cams malfunctioned. But guess what? They didn't," Jalen said, his words precise and unwavering. The courtroom gasped, some people exchanging glances, others shaking their heads in disbelief. The judge's face contorted with anger, but it was too late to stop it now. Jalen's attorney stepped forward and pressed play on the small device. The courtroom watched in horror as the footage appeared on the courtroom screen. The grainy video came into focus, showing the night of Marcus Carter's death. Jalen's father was unarmed, his hands raised in compliance, the officers surrounding him with their weapons drawn. Marcus had been following orders, doing everything right. And yet, what happened next made the blood run cold. The video showed Marcus being shot without warning, murdered in cold blood, as he had posed no threat. The room fell into stunned silence, the reality of what had been hidden for so long now exposed for all to see. But Jalen wasn't done. He looked at the screen, his jaw tightening as the final piece of the puzzle came to light. The video cut to a voice message from the officers involved in the shooting. It was a chilling conversation, one that had been carefully hidden from the public for years. "Harrington said we're good to go, no charges," the voice on the recording said, the words echoing through the room. Gasps erupted across the courtroom. The air was thick with disbelief, outrage, and shock. The judge's face went white, his lips trembling. The courtroom had become a scene of chaos, people shouting, some standing in disbelief, others muttering in anger. Judge Harrington slammed his gavel, his voice shaking as he tried to regain control. "Turn that off. This is outrageous," he shouted, his eyes wide, his once unshakable authority now gone. But it was too late. The damage had been done. The truth was out, and there was no escaping it. Judge Harrington's involvement in the cover-up had been exposed for all to see. His long-held position of power, the trust people had placed in him, all of it was now in jeopardy. Jalen didn't look at the judge. He didn't need to. He had already won. The moment he had waited for had arrived, and he wasn't backing down. What would you have done if you were in Jalen's shoes? Let us know in the comments. The judge's face twisted in rage as murmurs spread through the room, rippling through the crowd like a wave. His eyes darted around, searching for a way to regain control, but it was clear that the moment had passed. The truth had been exposed in front of everyone, people he had trusted, people who had placed their faith in him. The weight of what had just happened hit the courtroom with full force. The jury looked horrified, their faces pale as they processed the evidence in front of them. The video, the voice recordings, the undeniable proof, everything they had been told to believe for years was shattered. The judge, the man who was supposed to represent justice, was now revealed as the very person responsible for one of the biggest cover-ups in recent history. Prosecutors whispered among themselves, their voices low but filled with anger. Some stood frozen in disbelief, unable to comprehend the level of corruption they had just witnessed. The court officers exchanged uneasy glances, their hands instinctively reaching for their radios, unsure of how to proceed, but knowing that everything had just changed. The truth was out. Jalen Carter had just exposed one of the biggest corruption scandals in the legal system. Judge Harrington had not only covered up the murder of Jalen's father, Marcus Carter, but he had done it before. His hands weren't just dirty with this one case. They were stained with years of hidden crimes, and the truth had finally come to light. "Your Honor," the prosecutor spoke up, his face dark with fury. His voice was shaking, filled with raw emotion. "I request an immediate investigation into Judge Harrington's conduct." His words echoed in the room, a clear demand for action that could no longer be ignored. The judge's knuckles whitened as he gripped the gavel, the tremble in his hands betraying the rage he was trying to control. "This is nonsense. This is—" he sputtered, trying to regain his composure, but his voice faltered. His usual arrogance, once so powerful, now seemed fragile and weak in the face of undeniable truth. He couldn't mask the fear creeping into his voice. But before he could finish his protest, the doors of the courtroom opened with a heavy thud. Court officers stepped forward, their movements swift and deliberate. The tension in the room thickened as Judge Harrington's own security detail moved into position, surrounding him. Jalen's heart raced, but his face remained calm. He had done it. He had taken down the man who had destroyed his family. He stood tall, watching as the officers approached. There was no turning back now. "Judge William Harrington, you are hereby removed from this bench," one of the officers announced, his voice firm. The words rang out with authority, making it clear that there was no escape for the man who had once held so much power. The room fell silent as the gravity of the situation sank in. Harrington opened his mouth to protest, but no sound came out. His eyes darted from the officers to Jalen, his jaw clenching, but the room was already shifting. The security detail moved in, and the judge's arms were quickly cuffed, his gavel left abandoned on the table. His eyes, once filled with smug confidence, were now clouded with panic. The man who had ruined so many lives, who had orchestrated so much suffering, was finally facing justice. The courtroom erupted into chaos, the sound of whispers and gasps filling the air. People stood in shock, some cheering, some stunned into silence. It wasn't just a victory for Jalen, it was a victory for everyone who had ever been let down by the system. For the first time, a judge who had betrayed his oath was going to be held accountable for his actions. And as Jalen watched the officers escort Judge Harrington out of the courtroom, he knew that the fight wasn't over. There was still more work to do, more people to bring to justice. But today was a step toward the truth finally prevailing. What would you do if you were in Jalen's position? Tell us in the comments. Jalen sat back down, his heart racing as the weight of what had just happened sank in. He had done it. The years of pain, the countless sleepless nights, and the quiet determination had led to this moment. His father's case had been reopened. The truth had been exposed. And the man responsible for everything, the man who had once controlled the very system, meant to protect the innocent, was no longer in power. The officers who had been involved in the cover-up were taken into custody, their arrogance and indifference now replaced by the cold reality of their actions. The justice that had been denied to Jalen and his family for so long was finally being served. And Judge Harrington? He would never sit on that bench again. The gavel he had once wielded so ruthlessly would no longer hold sway over anyone. As the courtroom began to quiet, Jalen's chest swelled with a mixture of relief and triumph. He had achieved what seemed impossible. And yet, it wasn't just about the legal victory. This wasn't about a win in a courtroom or a man in handcuffs. For Jalen, the real victory wasn't found in the legal jargon or the formalities. It was in the knowledge that his father's story had finally been told. He stood tall, his voice steady and clear as he addressed the room one last time. "This isn't just for my dad," Jalen said, his eyes scanning the faces of those around him. His words carried a weight far beyond the immediate moment. "This is for everyone who was silenced by people like you." There was a sense of finality in his words, a declaration that extended beyond his own personal grief. Jalen wasn't just speaking for his father. He was speaking for everyone who had ever been wronged by the system, for anyone who had been forced to live under the crushing weight of injustice without a voice. His words echoed in the room, a reminder that truth, no matter how long it takes, will always come to light. The room was silent as Jalen walked out of the courtroom, his head held high. His mother, standing off to the side, caught his eye as he passed, and her expression softened with pride. He had done it. He had taken on the system, the people who had wronged him, and he had won. The injustice that had shattered his family was no longer a shadow hanging over them. The truth had been revealed. And as Jalen stepped out of that courtroom, he knew one thing for sure. His father would have been proud. Marcus Carter had lived a life built on doing what was right, standing up for others, and challenging the very systems that sought to oppress. In this moment, Jalen had honored his father's legacy in the most profound way possible. Jalen had proven that no matter the odds, no matter the forces working against you, justice could prevail. And now, as the weight of everything finally lifted, Jalen felt the sense of closure he had been yearning for. His father's story had been told, and the world would know what had really happened. The victory wasn't just in the courtroom. It was in the fact that his father's voice would no longer be silenced. What would you have done in Jalen's place? Let us know in the comments. Months later, Jalen's life had changed in ways he never could have imagined. The quiet teenager, once overshadowed by the grief of losing his father, had found his voice, and now that voice was echoing across the country. His courageous stand against Judge Harrington and the system of corruption had ignited a fire in people everywhere. Jalen became an advocate for families fighting against corrupt judges and law enforcement. He spoke out for those who had been silenced, for those whose stories had been buried under layers of injustice. He used his newfound platform to educate, inspire, and empower others to take action. His story, the way he had taken down a man in power and exposed the truth, became a beacon of hope for many. Families who had once felt powerless found strength in his example. And, through his advocacy, Jalen led the charge for real change. The legal system, once untouchable in the eyes of many, was shaken to its core. Reforms were made, laws were scrutinized. People started asking the right questions, questioning the very foundations that had allowed corruption to flourish for so long. The blind eye that had turned away from injustice was now forced to look directly at it. And it was because of Jalen's determination that the conversation about reform had even begun. His actions, though born of personal pain, had sparked a nationwide movement for transparency, accountability, and fairness. And the best part? Jalen Carter, the boy they had once ignored, was now on his way to becoming a lawyer himself. The very profession that had once seemed so far out of reach was now within his grasp. With every step he took, Jalen moved closer to achieving his dream of becoming an attorney, of using his knowledge of the law to protect the innocent, fight for justice, and ensure that no one would ever have to go through what his family had. His passion for justice had transformed him, and the boy who once sat silently in a courtroom, watching the world unfold around him, was now a force to be reckoned with in the legal world. Because in the end, the truth always wins. It may take years, and the fight may be long and hard, but the truth has a way of prevailing. And Jalen had proven that, no matter how young, how underestimated, or how silenced, standing up for what's right could change everything. He had taken on the system and won, showing everyone that a single voice, no matter how small, could bring about monumental change. Jalen's journey was just beginning. The world had already seen his strength, his courage, and his unwavering dedication to justice, and there was no telling where his passion would take him next. But one thing was certain. His story was far from over. What do you think? Did Jalen do the right thing? Let us know in the comments. Like and share this story if you believe in standing up for justice.